Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Howling Coyote. And I'm privileged to have some researchers from Lancaster University, Department of Psychology, Elise Osterhaus and Helen Nuttall. And I came across their paper on, it's called Toward an Understanding of Healthy Cognitive Aging. And the context wherein I found them was that I was working on a computer simulation model and comparing some theories of aging. And I came upon their work and I thought, wow, this would be a fun podcast to have. So, Elise, would you mind kicking us off and telling us about the work that you've been doing for your graduate degree?
Mm-hmm. Sure, thank you very much. So the paper you were talking about, we recently published that in Gerontology's journal. And basically we discuss different cognitive aging theories where we look at where we discuss mechanisms of healthy cognitive aging, and how do we age healthily, and why do some people develop dementia and cognitive difficulties whilst others don't. And basically we discuss two main theories. One is cognitive reserve, which basically states that throughout our life, our lifestyle experiences, such as whether we attend education or not, but also our lifestyle choices, such as whether we engage in social activities, cognitively stimulating activities, and leisure activities, etc. Whether basically the theory says these kind of experiences and lifestyles, they help us build this kind of reserve that then helps us later on in life when our brain experiences normal age-related pathology and stuff. It then helps us remain or maintain our cognitive performance, even though we have this age-related pathology. And then another theory, one of the other main theories we discuss is the scaffolding theory. The scaffolding theory of aging and cognition, which basically takes a more multifaceted approach. So they also include lifestyle and life experiences, but also more adverse experiences, or such as they include genetic predisposure, toxin exposure, but also things like depression, and how that influences our brain structure and brain function, and then also how that then relates to the age-related cognitive decline that we experience, and how we can maintain our cognitive ability at a later age. And we basically compare these two theories and discuss their similarities and differences, and also where there's still some gaps to be filled with future research.
Yeah, and to me, it seemed rather obvious that the more factors that one considers, the better model one has. So, why wouldn't everybody run for the scaffolding model?
I think so when doing research, we try to take as many factors in account as possible. But obviously, doing that also, we need a bigger and bigger sample size. So sometimes going for the more simple model can still tell us a lot about aging and cognitive aging. But also cognitive reserve is also a lot focused on neurodegenerative diseases like dementia and Parkinson's, whilst the scaffolding theory of aging and cognition is they do mention the adverse effect of tau pathology and stuff, but they're not really that much focused on neurodegenerative diseases. So in that way, I think the cognitive reserve theory is a bit stronger, and the scaffolding theory can improve a little bit more. I don't know, maybe Helen has more to add to that as well.
I think that's a really great point, Elise. No, I support what you say. Sounds good.
Yeah, and in relation to this, um, I was recently at the Alzheimer's disease conference in Göteborg, and I was impressed with the amount of money that was going into drug development. And I was off in the corner with the people talking about preventing dementia through lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And we were a pitifully poor bunch compared to the glory and grandeur of the biomarker find the perfect drug people. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about the whole field in that respect, where people are focusing and where the resources are going.
I don't really know much about the pharmacological industry and like the research they do, and that's on that side. But I do reckon like some people don't, like, even though they might live like a healthy life, like they don't smoke, they're not obese, they like physically active and stuff, sometimes people still develop like some condition under degenerative disease, and maybe like in that case medication can help. Like maybe medication can help like our brain function as well, where like our lifestyle and stuff falls short. I don't know. do you
Yeah,
do
and
you
I
have
think
yeah.
just to add to that as well, from a behavior change perspective, sometimes it's easier for people to accept a medication than it is to accept what they perceive to be a significant change to their lifestyle. So we know that exercise can be a brilliant treatment, if you like, for mental health challenges, but it's often very difficult to encourage people to take up something like that compared to encouraging them to consider a pharmaceutical intervention. So I think it also relates to how willing people are to embrace these different types of interventions and the perceived quality of the clinical intervention from the recipient's perspective, perhaps as well.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly see that people prefer pills. People prefer the quick and easy solution to the slow and maybe more difficult solution.
Yeah, I think probably like with for example physical activity and like engaging in more cognitively stimulating activity like reading books or playing a musical instrument or learning a language, it takes like kind of a lot of effort, and I think it probably requires some kind of change, like a whole lifestyle change almost, and like formation of habit, which we know can take like several weeks. So compared to like that's like quite a long change before that happens, whilst like with medication can almost be immediate. I reckon, yeah.
Except there aren't any medications that actually work. So there's that problem. And unless something has changed in the last month, there's a lot of enthusiasm, of course.
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot of enthusiasm for Alzheimer's and dementia drugs, but there's not a whole amount of promise in terms of what the market has. So I'm not an expert, but that seems to be the way things are at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought maybe I could put up one of your diagrams, and I'm guessing that a lot of people who will be listening to this, for many people, this is all new. And I thought maybe if I put up one of the diagrams, you guys could explain it, for people who don't know this field at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so let me do that.
Yeah, that's a lovely idea.
Let's see. Always a challenge to find things on.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, here we go. Here we go. There we go. I like this. So, Elise, could you, for the people who never heard of any of this ever before in their whole lives, could you explain it?
Yes, so this is actually the diagram of the scaffolding theory of cognitive aging. So the one that takes a more like comprehensive approach. So like on the right hand side, we see the level of cognitive function and the rate of cognitive decline. So this can be like age related, but even like neurodegenerative related. So on the left hand side, we have our life course experiences. And these are split up in two. Those are the neural resource enrichment ones, which are like the positive factors that influence our like cognitive function later in life. And then you can think of like intellectual engagement, like reading a book, education, physical activity, learning multiple languages. And then there is also the neural resource depletion, which is more the adverse factors that can influence our cognition later in life. And here we see, well, stress is one, the like tau pathology, APO, that's like very common in Alzheimer's. And then even low socioeconomic status, depression, and toxin exposure, as I mentioned before as well. And these two, and then we also have our normal biological aging. So that's like the brain pathology that happens like, and that's like normal with aging that we all experience. So, and these positive and negative lifestyle factors then feed kind of into our brain structure and brain function. And with brain structure, we can think about like, for example, cortical thinning or thickness in general, and dopaminergic activity. And dopamine is very important for like rewards, habit formation, but also like for movement, for example. And then there's brain function. This is more like the brain areas that lit up when we perform certain cognitive tasks, but also like the way different brain areas communicate with each other. So basically, neural resource depletion can negatively influence brain structure, for example, causing cortical thinning, negatively influence brain function, for example, brain regions are not that able to communicate that well with each other anymore. Whilst then neural resource enrichment, the positive factors, they can then enhance like brain structure and brain function in a similar way. For example, they support brain activity, for example, by allowing multiple, for example, by strengthening the communication between different brain regions. But they don't only influence brain structure and brain function, they also feed into compensatory, I can't speak anymore. Compensatory scaffolding, which is basically our ability to compensate for like any cognitive difficulties or any brain like brain pathology that we experience. And this, for example, what we see in older adults, for example, is that like during cognitive tasks, they, instead of recruiting one side of the brain, they recruit both sides of the brain. And for example, more frontal regions than like more regions in the back. They might also recruit different brain regions that like younger adults don't recruit during those tasks. And then let's see. Then there's the intervention as well that feeds into compensatory scaffolding. So that means like even though like brain structure and brain function, they influence compensatory scaffolding, and so do the positive and negative lifestyle factors. With intervention, we can like enhance our compensatory scaffolding, for example, by encouraging people to engage in social and intellectual activities, to engage in physical exercise. Cognitive training is one as well, and meditation. I think I'm not very well versed in the meditation literature, but I think there's an increasing literature in meditation that shows like some increased like brain activity as well in certain regions. And then brain structure, brain function, they feed into the level of cognitive function and the rate of cognitive decline. For example, when we experience cortical thinning, we can expect lower cognitive function as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought it might interest you that I've been working on a computer model to predict cognitive decline, and I might make some modifications on my model from this very diagram, and it improved prediction.
Really? That's really cool.
Oh, wow, that's brilliant.
That's exciting.
It's a poster I presented at the Alzheimer's disease conference that the scaffolding theory improves prediction of cognitive decline. And
may I ask, like, what exactly did you like change in the model that like made it improve?
I built in some feedback loops because I was already aware, of these things are sort of obvious. There are some natural feedback loops here. And actually, I'm not sure that it shows on the diagram, but I think this arrow goes both ways. So that as things get worse, they build upon themselves and they get worser. So there's a kind of a deviation amplification process at work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
how much benefit did it have, the changes you made?
It improved the prediction by about 20%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
No, it was good. And I had this fantasy that maybe you guys had some data you could send me to plug into my computer model and I could play together. So it's something to keep in mind. But are you guys familiar with Bredesen? Do you know that name?
I don't think I've come across it. No.
So he's an interesting character because he embraces this way of thinking. And his first paper was a report of 10 people who reversed Alzheimer's disease. Or, well, 9 out of 10 reversed Alzheimer's disease. And then he published a paper on 100 patients who over 90% reversed Alzheimer's disease. And then he went commercial. So and set up clinics to make a lot of money reversing Alzheimer's disease. And it's really interesting because he has a protocol that addresses almost all of these areas. So he changes people's diets. He gives them high dose antioxidants, and other nutritional factors.
Yeah.
He engages them in new learning. He engages them in socialization. He gets them to exercise, to do meditation, to do Tai Chi and Qigong, to learn new stuff. He says the most effective things to learn are Chinese and differential equations. And and it's really impressive because he has PET scans of people getting rid of amyloid and tau burden. And he's highly criticized in many circles because he doesn't do randomized controlled trials. And the interesting thing to me, and this is how I started getting into computer modeling of cognitive decline, is that it would take about 1,000 years to do randomized controlled trials on all of these individual factors. And as he says, what if changing one factor isn't enough?
Mm-hmm.
What if you have to change 8? And the difficulty for me with his protocol is that I can't find anyone to do it. And so he works with people who were previously high earning, high functioning individuals with highly supported families who make them do it with the motivation that they could get back to their high status, high functioning activities. And here in central Maine, we don't have a lot of those kind of people. I hope you have more. I'm sure you have more in Lancaster, but mostly we're pretty rural, and I can't get anyone to do all of this stuff. And yet, to me, I mean, I disagree with the critics. I find it inspiring that someone did it and reversed Alzheimer's disease, even if I can't find any patients who will do it. But I thought you might have heard of him because he so targets everything on this diagram.
That work sounds familiar. I might have heard it somewhere.
Yeah.
But not I can't really specifically remember.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very interesting approach. And I think, like you say, Lewis, it takes a very highly motivated individual who has a lot to really gain by pursuing that lifestyle overhaul. Like when we started this discussion and we talked about drug interventions versus lifestyle interventions, you know, it's same. I guess some of the reasons are similar for why perhaps you can't find people who want to engage with that extensive lifestyle overhaul, because it would take a great deal of discipline and commitment. And you mentioned about the support networks and sense of community around them might not be as strong as in other groups. But yeah, in Lancaster, we're based in the northwest of England. We're not far away from some quite rural areas, actually. And in the north of England, there's greater kind of health inequality in a negative sense compared to in the south of England. Socioeconomic position is somewhat lower, earning power is a bit lower. So we're perhaps not as dissimilar to Maine as you might think.
Our largest city is 60,000 people in the state of Maine. I live in near the second largest city, which is 30,000 people. So we're pretty rural. But anyway, and I've had the pleasure of being near Lancaster because we every October we go to Penrith in the lake.
Oh, nice.
And this last October we hiked the West Highland Way.
Nice.
Which,
very nice.
Yes, it was really spectacular. So
you'll have to stop by in Lancaster this October.
Yeah.
Usually fly into either Glasgow or Manchester.
Nice.
And, you know, depending on the prices and whatnot, because they're about
Yeah.
So what's next for you guys? What's exciting your passions now? What's on the horizon?
Elise, would you like to talk about what you're currently working on and the data you're analyzing?
Sure. So we actually looked at in an online study during COVID, we looked at like cognitive reserve and the effects on like word finding ability in older age. And we found like that cognitive reserve, so education, lifestyle experiences, that they were mainly like important in middle-aged adults, but not in older adults. So that was very interesting. And Then I'm currently finalizing a paper on in Parkinson's disease, where I look at like the relationship between like words that describe physical action and like the motor impairments in Parkinson's disease. This isn't without brain data because it's also online because it was like the end of COVID. And then currently I've just finished data collection on a healthy aging study where I look at like the underlying brain function or neurosignature of like also words that describe physical action versus words that don't describe physical action. Yeah, and then who knows? I don't know. I'm very passionate about brain research and brain data and looking at that as well. And actually, another study we're finalizing is one on where we look at like how with EEG data, that's like where you get a cap on your head and with like electrodes, and we then can record brain waves. And with certain statistical methods, you can kind of infer how different brain regions communicate with each other, and then relate that to cognition and how that changes with age. So that can give us then like an idea of like, does the brain function like change, and how does that relate to changes in cognition in older versus younger adults? So I'm actually that's probably one of the papers I'm most excited about. Yeah.
And you're also working on a study with me, aren't you, Elise, where we're looking at trying to entrain different brain rhythms in healthy aging as well. So coming from more of a speech and communication perspective, when people are listening to speech and trying to remember kind of information, does entrainment of certain brain oscillations help to support their ability to remember speech? Because that is something that breaks down in healthy aging in terms of the types of brain rhythms that might be supporting maintenance of information and memory. Some of those brain rhythms start to diminish, and especially if you experience age-related hearing loss, which is a very, very common situation in the UK. Over 70% of individuals aged 70 and above experience a significant degree of age-related hearing loss. It often takes 10 years before they'll seek help through a hearing aid. For them, they have even further deterioration of some of these oscillatory signatures that support the brain's ability to understand incoming speech and retain it in memory. So we're using transcranial magnetic stimulation to manipulate brain activity using magnetic influences to try to entrain some of these EEG rhythms in the brain that are naturally kind of happening, to try and boost them, if you like, to see if that can be of benefit to people when they're listening to information and retaining it in memory. So there's quite a few things going on really in the lab.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah, Elise will be finishing up her thesis in summer, but we continue to work on this project that I just described for a few more months after that until next year. And then you'll decide, Elise, won't you, whether you wish to pursue a career in academia or perhaps go in different directions. The world will be our oyster, and see where your path takes you.
Yeah.
And I'm intrigued with how are you measuring the EEG in relation to the magnetic stimulation?
Elise, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I can tell a little bit about the protocol. Yeah. So basically we record the EEG data, so the brain data, whilst we're stimulating. So it's like continuous recording, and the EEG system is like it's specifically made to be compatible with TMS. And you do have some distortions in the EEG data when the stimulation happens. But you know that, so like you kind of like account, or you your research question is around that as well. So what participants do is they hear a series of 9 digits, and they have to remember those 9 digits in the right order, which is obviously very, very difficult. And then the stimulation happens. And then, so they have to ignore the stimulation, but after the stimulation, they also hear either a sentence that's legible or one that's not, that's more like noise. And they have to ignore that as well. And afterwards, they have to click the digits in the right order. And during that whole process, we record the EEG data. So we have like before the stimulation and after the stimulation and during the digits as well.
And what area of the brain are you stimulating?
So do you want to take this
No,
one?
you keep going.
Yeah. So we stimulate on the top of the head, the vertex, we call it. There's like, because there's like not a lot of brain area right under the skull's like quite thick, the signal or the stimulation more like dissipates around the brain, and that's more like a control condition. Then there's an occipital, so at the back of the head area that we stimulate, which I believe is more like involved in or hypothesized to be involved in like attention and stuff. And then we also stimulate like on the left side of the brain, the superior temporal gyrus, which is then more involved in auditory processing.
Right. I'm familiar with the TMS treatment for depression.
So in this case, we're specifically interested in alpha frequency and oscillations that occur at an alpha frequency. So we find each individual's alpha frequency before they begin the study, and then we set the TMS to be delivered at the same rate as their individual alpha frequency to try and add a personalized element to the entrainment. And then the sort of outcome measure is the power of the alpha activity and whether that's modulated by the TMS or not. So we'll see. We're currently analysing some of the data, aren't we, Elise? One of our collaborators is. So yeah, we will keep you informed.
Yes, very exciting.
So the outcome is improved remembrance of the 9 digits.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So on the behavioral side, it would be an improved ability to remember those digits. And on the neural side, it would be observing the change in the power of the alpha activity and if there's a relation between the alpha activity and the behavioral change. And then we have the different locations on the head to try and understand, is this a sensory specific phenomenon in terms of, is it being driven by changes to sensory alpha activity in temporal cortex around the auditory cortex, or is it some kind of domain general process which is represented by the site in the occipital cortex to understand, is it something that's not specific to auditory processing but a general improvement in a domain general sense.
So it might be a little too specific, but I'm really curious, which part of the temporal pole are you targeting?
So the superior temporal gyrus.
Okay.
Yes. Posterior superior temporal gyrus.
Yeah, which would be part of the default mode network, I think. Well, when you think about story brain.
Yes, and so we're targeting it primarily because it's part of the broader auditory kind of association cortex. So it's very difficult to target primary auditory cortex because it's quite deep inside the cortex with regards to what TMS is capable of doing. So when we're stimulating auditory regions, we tend to go for coordinates around superior temporal gyrus, the posterior portion, to target secondary and association cortical areas. But yeah, as you mentioned, these brain areas don't just do one thing. There's connectivity that's distributed throughout different regions. So it's very difficult to try and answer everything in one study. And if we find that there's some interesting results, we'll have to try to dig down to understand what the origin of that is. Yeah.
You remind me of a student I had once who wrote country music songs. And there's a neuropsychological test in which people are given 20 words to remember. And most people remember 4 to 6. And he got 19 because he turned the words into a country music song.
Wow.
Very smart. Mnemonics, right?
Yeah. It's a very good strategy.
Yeah.
Which is probably how the superior posterior temporal gyrus is linked into the default mode network.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was very impressive.
Yeah.
So that sounds very cool. And do you think there's a role for TMS in improving memory among a clinical population?
I think they are already like doing some TMS studies like in clinical populations, and that does seem to improve. And like in intervention, brain stimulation is like we also mentioned that in the paper. Brain stimulation is like one of the ways we can directly influence brain structure and function, or brain function.
Yeah. Where I kind of really see neuromodulation as holding promise is when it's an adjunct to another intervention, to really try to help optimize the state of the brain at the time the brain then receives the intervention, if you will, so that the most benefit can be derived from the intervention. So I think applying brain stimulation in a way that an intervention can then benefit from is a very nice direction within neuromodulation research. I think sometimes people overpromise what brain stimulation can do alone without any additional cognitive therapy or cognitive intervention or physical intervention. But I certainly think it's an avenue for helping to assist with improved brain function, and we have yet to learn. And I'm excited to be, working in that area and seeing where things go. I think what I'm very passionate about is what factors can modulate neuroplastic potential of the brain, and I think that there might be room for brain stimulation to be in there. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, it certainly seems, I mean, it certainly seems preferable to ECT for depression. I mean, yeah. So much less profitable in the United States, sadly.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope you don't have that problem in the UK.
Yeah, ECT is a world away from magnetic stimulation, the TMS type, and I think often people come with some preconceptions because they've heard about ECT in films or on TV. They're wondering if there are some parallels with TMS, but it's a very, very different, far more pleasant experience, for want of a better description. But thankfully, we have many younger and older adults who are willing to support our studies, and we wouldn't be anywhere without their support and their contribution to allowing us to collect their data. So we're really thankful for the openness and willingness of our participants in Lancaster and the surrounding areas. We're very fortunate.
So so that's really interesting. There were a couple other of your studies that I read, and there was one called The Effect of Motor Resource Suppression on Speech Perception in Noise in Younger and Older Listeners.
Yeah.
Now, Elise wasn't involved in that one.
No.
So,
But Kate Slade was, and she is also one of the co-authors of our paper.
Yeah, so Kate Slade was working as the postdoctoral research associate on the grant that contains the TMS study, and she's recently moved into a faculty position, and Elise is actually working as a postdoctoral research associate alongside finishing up her thesis. So Elise is very much intermixed into this work as well. But yeah, this was an online study that we did during COVID, where we explored the role of the motor system in supporting speech perception and how that role might change with age.
Yeah, can you give us a summary of what you found?
Yeah, sure. So we found that when individuals were listening to different types of speech and having to do a task alongside that, so it was kind of a dual task paradigm, when they were engaging in a task called articulatory suppression, whilst also listening to speech and trying to identify the speech, articulatory suppression was a task where they had to say a word, which was the. And the idea of articulatory suppression is it soaks up your motor resources, so it occupies your motor resources. The idea being that if those motor resources are then occupied, the speech perception system can't draw from them to support the identification of the speech that you're listening to, because those motor resources are occupied through you physically having to articulate this word there. And that was quite difficult for the younger listeners. And they found that their performance was adversely affected when they were engaged in that specific articulatory suppression task, compared to if they were just passively listening without any articulatory suppression task. But the older adults performed equivalently across conditions. And we wondered if that might mean that in general, there is less opportunity for the older adults to draw from these additional speech motor resources during speech perception. So whilst the younger adults have them to draw from, the older adults may not, and that might reflect a general reduction of resources kind of across the board, so at least in the sample that we studied online.
So what would be the clinical significance of this?
So I suppose in terms of the clinical significance, it wasn't a clinical sample. Everybody was cognitively normal. We didn't have anybody with cognitive decline. But I suppose if you were to try to draw out what is meaningful from this, it suggests that when we're listening and communicating, we use a broad network of brain areas, and the motor system may be one such area that we use to support that process. And as we age, we have fewer resources to draw from. So I guess circling back to Elise's points around scaffolding and trying to ensure that we have compensatory scaffolding processes available to draw from as we age, then clinically, what we need to be doing is ensuring that we're building that scaffolding in older adults or in ourselves, sort of investing before we get to that age bracket. Because if there is a reduction in the resources that we're going to be able to draw from, then having some scaffolding to try and compensate is going to be vital in order to live a healthy life. Because in the UK we have an increased lifespan, but health span isn't increasing at the same rate as lifespan. So trying to match those two more closely is really important.
You know, you made me think of, I was just in the hospital this weekend running the adult medicine teaching service for the what you call registrars. And
Yeah,
it struck me, you know, we still have to wear masks in the hospital.
yeah,
And it struck me how much the mask wearing deteriorates the communication.
it really does. Yeah.
And I noticed that it was dramatically worse with the older the patient, the worse it was. And I thought that it was just hearing, but
Yeah.
I now, as I listen to you, that they might also be monitoring the motor movements of speech
Yes.
in some sort of mirror neuron fashion.
Absolutely. And you may already have an awareness of this, but as individuals lose their hearing acuity, auditory brain areas become more responsive to visual input. So there is cross-modal plasticity that occurs in, for example, areas such as superior temporal gyrus. And it's thought that that is there to help to disambiguate the speech through more visual mechanisms, when that disambiguation cannot occur through purely auditory mechanisms. So if you take away those visual cues, which you might assume an older adult who has been experiencing age-related hearing loss for some time, if you take those visual cues away from them through mask wearing, then that's a real lack of information that they're then being provided with to help them understand the communication situation.
Indeed.
Yeah, one of my PhD students, Brandon O'Hanlon, is currently working on investigating if we can combine auditory and tactile inputs for instances such as this, where there's no visual information available. And if we can train the brain to understand what tactile inputs mean with regards to the analogous kind of representation in the auditory modality, to see if that's a way in which we can sort of support communication and support speech perception. Yeah.
Fascinating. It's
Yeah.
interesting because we live in a siloed world, and the infectious disease department is in charge of masking, and they have no understanding of the communication and psychological impact of masking. That all they care about is spreading germs. And
everybody comes from their own perspective, don't they? And in the UK, it's quite common that some of the tests that you might encounter in hospital, for example, the sort of mini mental state exams, the various cognitive decline assessments that you might have performed at your bedside, are often delivered by somebody speaking from behind a mask with background noise, in terms of the sounds of the hospital ward, or perhaps in a GP office where there's also different types of background noise. And if somebody has a significant hearing loss, there's evidence to suggest that that can then present as cognitive decline, because we've not actually been able to engage with the activity fully because of the sensory impairment, and that their low test score indicates a sensory impairment and not a generic cognitive decline impairment. So there's some really interesting work being done by colleagues in Manchester, where they're trying to create visual alternatives of some of these tests to ensure they're not confounded by auditory processing and deterioration of hearing. But it's really important, and people, as I say, people think from their own corner of the universe, which is understandable, because as academics you get very bogged down in the nitty-gritty of your research area. And it's important that we consider different perspectives and how things can affect, you know, as you mentioned with the mask wearing, yes, infectious diseases and reducing transmission is paramount, but there are indirect consequences as well.
Right. And you know, we wear these surgical masks, which I read in one study reduce spread by 7%. As opposed to N95s, which are very effective. And so I wonder, at this stage in the post-pandemic, if the 7% is worth it, is worth these other things that you and I are concerned with. Yeah. So, so if you had unlimited funding, what's the study that you would do next?
I think,
Elise, I'm sure there are studies that you would like to do, because when Elise started her PhD, it was approximately 6 months before the first kind of lockdown period began in the UK. So Elise's empirical work has been heavily disrupted by restrictions to testing. So Elise, what did you hope to do in your PhD that you've not been able to do? Because I suppose that's the thing that you would be wanting to pursue.
Yeah, so I was very interested in looking at biomarkers and neurocognitive markers of Parkinson's disease. So can we how can we diagnose it sooner and maybe provide treatment sooner? And also can we so the first part of the study would be basically looking at brain networks and the relationship in Parkinson's disease, and can we use these brain functional networks using EEG to detect Parkinson's maybe earlier on, and also can we use TMS to stimulate the dorsal prefrontal lateral cortex to increase as Helen mentioned before, boost the brain to help people with Parkinson's disease, and also looking at lifestyle experiences. But that was all because for those kind of studies, clinical studies, you need NHS ethics, and it took quite a while, and they bolstered by education as well. But the coolest thing would be to take a lifestyle or lifespan approach, of course, and that needs a lot of resources. Where we look at like from people from like when they're born till like when they basically like pass, to see like, okay, what did they do during their life, and like what did they age like healthily, or did they develop like some neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease? Because for example, Parkinson's disease, often the cause is unknown, hence it's called idiopathic Parkinson's disease, and still the main risk factor for that is age. But obviously, like there must something must be at play why some people develop Parkinson's disease and others don't. And I think in order to like figure that out and untangle like why and how, we need that lifespan approach. But that's very difficult with the resources we normally get, and also of course like people's willingness as well to stay in a study for their whole life. Plus, I won't be able to survive the whole study probably either, but it would be really cool.
Unless there are some developments in modern medicine, Elise, we could freeze you. We could freeze you for a while and then
Yes,
thaw you out
find
in
the
a few
outcomes.
decades.
Yeah. You know, we're doing something more modest than that, which is we're gathering life stories of people, and we're making estimates of behavior based on their life stories, estimates of these factors, and which is why I was so drawn to computer simulation modeling, because you know it minimizes noise, because you create these series of differential equations that solve, you know, maybe 5,000 equations that you solve iteratively 1,200 times. And, you know, in that respect, you can take relatively crude assessments and potentially make predictions. So that's what we're working on here at the University of Maine. And that was the kind of work that I presented at the Alzheimer's disease conference. But it's not as sexy as drug development or biomarkers.
It depends on your audience. I like the sound of what you're doing. I'd be really interested to see your poster, actually. I don't know whether there's a copy that you're able to share, but
copy, absolutely. I will make a note to do that. And the next year's conference, which I hope to go to, is in Lisbon.
Oh, lovely.
Spain.
Yes, which is a place I've always wanted to visit. And perhaps, Elise, I will see you there, because there is so much on biomarkers for cannot believe the amount of information on biomarkers for Parkinson's.
That will be really interesting. Yeah.
So if you go, please email me and we can meet for coffee.
Yeah, that sounds like fun.
Right. So in the last few minutes, what have you not said that people would really love to hear?
So I'd like to say go get your hearing tested. That's really, really important. As I said earlier in the podcast, often people live with a significant hearing loss for 10 years before seeking any help. And there's a lot of stigma around discussing and disclosing hearing loss compared to, say, visual loss. People are far more accepting to have their sight tested and to accept glasses than they are for hearing loss, because of stigmatism around hearing aids and ageism. But it's incredibly important because it's a significant modifiable factor for cognitive decline in dementia. So if people take up hearing aids, that can help to restore social communication and interaction. It can improve mental well-being, and it will also reintroduce some sensory input into brain areas that have lost some sensory input over a number of years. So that's a really important message that I'd like to share in the context of our conversation around cognitive decline and dementia.
And
Elise, is there anything else? Sorry.
well, I think you make a really important point that general practitioners should be more assertive and aggressive in doing hearing testing. And probably audiology should be moved into the GP surgery and not kept in a separate facility. Which, anytime something is in a separate facility, it makes it so incredibly unlikely that people will go.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it just, again, it all comes down to the behavior change and how significant that effort is, perceived to be by the individual. But yeah, Elise, was there anything else that you wanted to add?
I think from one of the studies we did, I would, in line with something Helen said, like, don't wait till like you're older and then think like, oh, we'll then start moving and learning and stuff, because like, I can wait till to build my reserve or whatever. It's actually very important to start in even at a young age, because studies also show that people who engage in like physical activity at a young age, that has an effect at cognition in later life. So like every life stage is important, and definitely, yeah.
Definitely. I really agree with that. Yeah. And reducing kind of inflammatory markers and improving kind of vasculature and blood flow. I totally agree with that.
Yeah. There was a researcher at Mayo Clinic who was studying the role of glucose in cognitive decline. At some point, she declared that she ran out and joined a gym and began to exercise. Rosebud something was her name. And she began to exercise an hour a day because she said, oh my God, this is where it's at. So if we could only do more of that,
Definitely. Yeah. Even just walking.
Even just walking.
Some moderate walking.
There's a marvelous video, which you guys may have seen, called 23 and a half. And it's by a GP from Toronto. And he challenges people to only be sedentary for 23 and a half hours a day. And he shows them the amazing benefits of walking for half an hour.
Yeah. I think that's the guidance as well. Half an hour activity each day. But yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, well, here in the US, we're more extreme. The Surgeon General says an hour of exercise every day.
Oh.
All right. Well, I want to thank you guys.
Maybe if people spend an hour, they might need.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being on my podcast. It was really fun. I hope I didn't talk too much, because I haven't to do that. Yeah, for joining me.
No, thank you. It was really fun. It was lovely to talk to you, and we really appreciate you inviting us and giving us this opportunity to discuss our work and our thoughts about research and where things should go. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Yeah,
definitely. And I found the model part also very interesting, and like how that improved your predictions. That was really, really cool.
Yeah, I'll send you my posters.
Yes, please. That would be really great.
And maybe
we'll great. And I hope we can.
Yeah, maybe we meet in Lisbon next.
Yes. Yes, or in not in Penrith, in Lancaster.
Yeah.
We're going to walk the West Highland Way again, next, from north to south instead of south to north.
Nice.
October,
because
I really want to be at the Winter Droving Festival in Penrith, which I highly recommend. It celebrates bringing the sheep down from the highlands to the lowlands.
Really? I
And
haven't heard of that festival, but that sounds very fun.
it's very fun. And it's the last Saturday, I think, in October. And by the way, my background is the West Highland Way.
I was about to ask, what drew you to Penrith? Do you have links there through family or?
One of our great friends is a GP in Penrith. And so we've been doing workshops and programs with her around narrative medicine and things like that for 20 years.
Nice.
And so we just, my wife and I, we just like to go visit our friends. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
come up with excuses for doing so.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. All right. Well, so I will turn off the recording.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see how to do that. Oh, I should have stopped the sharing much earlier.